The Ghosts of Ebbets Field, Stories from Brooklyn's Lost Ballpark. Welcome, fellow travelers through time and memory, to a journey that will take you to the heart of Brooklyn, where concrete and steel now stand over sacred ground. This isn't just a baseball story, though the crack of the bat and the roar of the crowd echo through every page. This is a story about what we build, what we lose, and what refuses to die even when the wrecking ball swings. Settle in, because we're about to discover that some places hold on to their spirits so tightly that even 60 years after their destruction, they still call out to those willing to listen. Chapter 1. The Sound of Memory. The September evening hung over Crown Heights like a thick wool blanket, heavy with the kind of humidity that makes even lifelong New Yorkers pause and remember why they love autumn. Sarah Martinez walked slowly through the courtyard of the Ebbets Field apartments, her canvas messenger bag weighted down with community meeting flyers and the exhaustion of another long day fighting developers who saw dollar signs where she saw home. At 42, Sarah had spent most of her adult life as a community organizer, born to Puerto Rican parents who had settled in Crown Heights in the 1970s when the neighborhood was still finding its identity after the massive changes of the previous decades. She knew every crack in the sidewalk, every story behind the brownstones, every family that had struggled to stay as rents climbed and developers circled like vultures. But she had never experienced anything like what happened that night. The courtyard was alive with the familiar sounds of urban evening, children's laughter echoing from open windows, the rhythmic thump of a washing machine, the distant hum of traffic on Eastern Parkway. Sarah was thinking about tomorrow's meeting with the City Planning Commission when the world around her suddenly shifted. The ambient noise faded to a whisper, replaced by something impossible, the distant roar of a crowd, building to a crescendo of anticipation, followed by the sharp, unmistakable crack of wood meeting leather. "Strike three!" a voice boomed from nowhere, clear as a bell ringing through the humid air. Sarah stopped dead in her tracks, her heart hammering against her ribs. She scanned the courtyard, looking for a radio, a television, anything that could explain what she was hearing. But the windows above glowed with the blue light of modern screens, and the children had gone inside for dinner. The courtyard was empty except for scattered bicycles and the lone street lamp that marked the center of the space. That's when she saw him. Standing beneath the flickering street lamp, a figure materialized like heat rising from summer asphalt. He was tall and dignified, wearing a pristine Brooklyn Dodgers uniform that seemed to glow with its own light. The number 42 gleamed on his back as he slowly turned toward the invisible stands, touched the brim of his cap in a gesture of profound respect, and smiled a smile that carried both triumph and sadness. For a moment that felt like an eternity. His eyes met Sarah's across the courtyard, and she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of being seen and acknowledged by someone who understood the weight of fighting for what's right. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, the figure faded into the night air, leaving Sarah alone with her racing heart and the certainty that she had witnessed something that would change everything. Sleep came fitfully that night, filled with dreams of cheering crowds and the echo of that impossible voice calling, "Strike three." When morning came, Sarah found herself drawn back to the courtyard, searching for any sign of what she had experienced. In the harsh light of day, it seemed impossible, the kind of story she would have dismissed if someone else had told it to her. But the memory was too vivid, too real to ignore. She needed to talk to someone who might understand, someone who knew the history of this place. That led her to the door of Harold Hal Washington, apartment 6D, a man she had known peripherally for years as the building's unofficial historian and the keeper of stories about the Brooklyn Dodgers. Hal answered the door wearing a faded Jackie Robinson jersey and holding a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been brewing since dawn. At 87, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body had carried him through nearly 9 decades of Brooklyn history, but his eyes behind thick glasses were sharp and curious. "Sarah Martinez, right? The organizer who's always fighting for the community," he said, his voice carrying the warm rasp of someone who had spent decades telling stories. "What brings you to my door this early?" Sarah hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I saw something last night, Mr. Washington, in the courtyard, something that shouldn't have been possible." Hal's apartment was a shrine to Brooklyn baseball history, every wall covered with photographs, newspaper clippings, and memorabilia from the Dodgers' Brooklyn years. A framed ticket stub from Jackie Robinson's first game sat on the mantelpiece next to a baseball signed by the entire 1955 World Series championship team. The air smelled of old paper and the faintest trace of roasted peanuts. As Sarah described her encounter, Hal listened with the intense attention of someone who had learned to hear the stories that others might miss. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at a photograph on the wall that showed him as a young man in a vendor's uniform, standing outside Ebbets Field with a tray of peanuts and Cracker Jacks. "You saw him, didn't you?" Hal said finally, his voice soft as moth wings. "Number 42, tipping his cap to the stands." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "You believe me?" Hal smiled, a glimmer of something profound in his eyes. "Sarah, I worked at that ballpark for 3 summers in the early 1950s. I was there when Jackie Robinson was proving to the world that courage and dignity could change everything. And I've been living on this ground for over 50 years since they tore it down. You're not the first person to see things that shouldn't be there, but you're the first in a long time to come asking about it." He gestured toward the window that overlooked the courtyard. "Let me tell you something about this place. Ebbets Field wasn't just a ballpark. It was where Brooklyn learned to be a family, messy and loud and beautiful. When they demolished it in 1960, they thought they were just tearing down concrete and steel. But some things, some memories, they go deeper than foundations. They become part of the ground itself." Over the following days, Sarah found herself drawn back to Hal's apartment every evening after work. He would make coffee and tell her stories that painted vivid pictures of a Brooklyn that existed not just in memory, but seemed to shimmer just beneath the surface of their present reality. He spoke of the intimate dimensions of Ebbets Field, how every fan felt close to the action, how the famous Dodger Symphony Band would play from the stands, weaving music into the very fabric of the game. As Hal shared his memories, Sarah began to notice subtle phenomena around them. The scent of leather and pine tar would drift through the apartment despite the closed windows. Sometimes, as Hal described the roar of the crowd, Sarah was certain she felt a tremor beneath her feet, as if thousands of fans were stomping in unison somewhere far below. "The spirits aren't haunting this place," Hal explained one evening as they sat watching the courtyard from his window. "They're celebrating it. Every moment when people chose to be better than they thought they could be, when they chose community over division, when they chose hope over fear. That's what echoes here." Sarah began to understand that her sensitivity to these presences was connected to her own work as a community organizer, someone who naturally attuned herself to the emotional undercurrents of neighborhoods and their residents. She was a bridge builder, just as Ebbets Field had been, just as Jackie Robinson had been. Chapter 2. Breaking Barriers, Building Bridges. As autumn deepened, Sarah's evening conversations with Hal became a ritual that seemed to strengthen the supernatural presence around them. What had begun as Sarah's solitary experience was evolving into something shared, something that responded to their growing friendship and their willingness to engage with the invisible history beneath their feet. The stories that truly made the air around them hum with energy were those of Jackie Robinson. Hal, as one of the few remaining African-American fans who had witnessed Robinson break baseball's color barrier, spoke with a reverence that transcended mere admiration for athletic achievement. "You have to understand," Hal said one evening, his eyes distant with memory. "Jackie didn't just break a barrier in baseball. He broke something in all of us. In Brooklyn, he showed us what was possible when we dared to be better, to be fairer." Hal recounted the venomous taunts Robinson faced, the death threats, the isolation. But he also described the overwhelming support from Brooklyn's diverse communities who flocked to Ebbets Field to witness history. He painted pictures of Irish and Italian families sitting next to Jewish and black families, all united in their love for the Dodgers and their quiet pride in Jackie's courage. "There was this one afternoon in July 1951, Hal said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone who had told this story many times but never lost its power to move him. Dodgers were playing the Giants, and the place was packed. I was working the third base line when this white family sat down next to a black family who had been coming to games all season." As Hal spoke, Sarah began to hear the ambient sounds of a crowd, the murmur of conversation and the rustle of programs, as if the courtyard was filling with invisible spectators. The smell of roasted peanuts and hot dogs began to drift through the evening air, though there were no vendors anywhere in sight. "The white father was clearly uncomfortable at first," Hal continued, "kept looking around like he was worried about what people would think. But then Jackie came to the plate with 2 men on base and the Dodgers down by 1. The tension was incredible. You could feel it in the air like electricity before a storm." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, not from fear but from excitement, as if she were about to witness something extraordinary. Jackie worked the count to 3-2. The whole ballpark was on its feet, 30,000 people holding their breath. And when he connected, when that ball sailed over the right field wall, the sound was like nothing I'd ever heard before or since. But what I remember most wasn't the home run. It was watching those 2 fathers embrace, watching their kids cheer together, watching barriers dissolve in real time. As Hal finished his story, Sarah felt a presence beside her, warm and dignified and profoundly peaceful. She turned slightly and saw him clearly this time. Jackie Robinson, still in his Dodgers uniform, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, watching the empty courtyard as if he could see the game playing out in front of him. "He's here," Sarah whispered. Hal followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "He's always been here. We just finally learned how to listen." Over the following weeks, their evening conversations became a bridge between past and present. Sarah discovered that the supernatural phenomena intensified when they discussed not just baseball history, but the ongoing struggles for equality and community preservation that connected different eras. "You know what's remarkable?" Sarah said one evening, as they watched the ghostly figure of Jackie Robinson field ground balls in the invisible infield. "My work as a community organizer, it's not that different from what was happening here in the 1950s. We're still fighting to create spaces where people can come together across racial and cultural lines, still trying to prove that diversity makes us stronger." Hal leaned forward in his chair, his eyes bright with understanding. "That's exactly right. And that's why he's here, why all of this is happening now. The neighborhood is facing the same kind of threats that led to Ebbets Field being torn down: displacement, gentrification, the loss of affordable spaces where working families can gather and build community." As if responding to their conversation, the supernatural presence grew stronger. Sarah could now hear not just the sounds of individual games, but the layered voices of decades of fans, the accumulated cheers and conversations and shared experiences of a community that had found its identity in this place. "There's something else," Hal said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone before." He reached into his photo album and pulled out a yellowed newspaper clipping. "This is from the last game ever played at Ebbets Field, September 24th, 1957. I was there working my final shift as a vendor." Sarah read the headline: "Dodgers win final Brooklyn game." Below it was a photograph of fans streaming out of the ballpark, many of them crying. After the game ended, after most of the fans had gone home, I stayed behind to help clean up, Hal continued. I was walking through the empty stands when I heard someone crying. It was a little girl, maybe 10 years old, sitting alone in the upper deck. She was wearing a Jackie Robinson jersey and holding a baseball that looked like it had been signed by the entire team. The air around them grew warmer, and Sarah felt the unmistakable sensation of being listened to by someone who cared deeply about every word. I asked her where her parents were, and she said they were waiting for her outside, but she couldn't leave. She said she wanted to stay and keep the ballpark alive by remembering it. And you know what? I understood exactly what she meant. Hal's voice broke slightly. When we finally got up to leave, she handed me that signed baseball. Said she wanted me to keep it safe, to make sure people remembered what happened here. I've carried it with me for over 60 years, but I never understood why until now. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a scuffed baseball with faded signatures. As soon as it appeared, the supernatural presence around them intensified dramatically. Sarah could see not just Jackie Robinson now, but other figures in Dodgers uniforms, players she recognized from Hal's stories and photographs. They're all here, she breathed. They've always been here, Hal replied, waiting for someone to understand that the real game never ended, that the work they started still needs to be finished. Chapter 3. The Unfinished Game. As October arrived with its crisp air and changing leaves, Sarah discovered that her supernatural experiences at the former Ebbets Field site were beginning to influence her work as a community organizer in ways she hadn't expected. The conversations with Hal and the growing presence of Jackie Robinson's spirit were teaching her new approaches to community building and the power of shared spaces to transform lives. The crisis came when the city announced plans for a massive luxury development that would require the demolition of several affordable housing units adjacent to the Ebbets Field apartments. Sarah had fought similar battles before, but this one felt different, more personal, connected to the deeper history she was learning to understand. "They're doing it again," she said to Hal one evening as they sat in the courtyard, reading through the development proposal. Different developers, different decade, but the same story. Tear down what exists, build something expensive, push out the people who made this neighborhood what it is. The supernatural presence around them had grown stronger over the weeks, and tonight it felt almost urgent, as if the spirits of Ebbets Field were trying to communicate something important. Sarah could see Jackie Robinson more clearly than ever, and he was no longer alone. Other figures in vintage uniforms moved through the courtyard, players whose names she recognized from Hal's stories: Pee Wee Reese, Duke Snyder, Roy Campanella. "Look at them," Hal said softly. "They're not just remembering the past. They're trying to show us something about the present." The ghostly figures began to arrange themselves as if for a game, but this wasn't a recreation of any specific historical moment. Instead, it seemed to be a demonstration, a teaching moment about the power of teamwork and collective action. Sarah watched as Jackie Robinson took his position at second base, but instead of preparing for a double play, he began gesturing toward the modern apartment buildings that surrounded the courtyard. "He's showing us that the work isn't finished," Sarah realized. "The integration of baseball was just the beginning. The real game is about creating communities where everyone belongs, where everyone has a chance to succeed." Over the following days, Sarah began to approach her community organizing work with new energy and insight. She organized meetings not just to oppose the luxury development, but to articulate a positive vision for what the neighborhood could become. Drawing inspiration from the inclusive spirit of Ebbets Field, she brought together residents from different backgrounds, ages, and economic circumstances to discuss their shared hopes for the community. The supernatural phenomena seemed to respond to these efforts. During one particularly successful community meeting, held in the courtyard on a mild November evening, several residents reported seeing figures in vintage baseball uniforms standing at the edges of the gathering, as if the spirits of Ebbets Field were lending their support to the modern struggle for community preservation. Mrs. Rodriguez saw him too, Sarah told Hal after the meeting. She said she looked up during my presentation and saw a tall black man in a baseball uniform nodding his approval. She didn't know who Jackie Robinson was until I showed her a photograph, but she said she felt like he was encouraging her to speak up about the affordable housing crisis. The climactic moment came during the city council hearing on the proposed development. Sarah had prepared extensively, gathering testimony from residents, researching the history of displacement in Brooklyn, and developing alternative proposals that would preserve affordable housing while allowing for responsible development. But as she stood to address the council, she felt the familiar warmth that had come to signal Jackie Robinson's presence. This time, however, it was stronger than ever, as if not just one spirit, but an entire community of past and present residents were standing with her. 60 years ago, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. This neighborhood was home to Ebbets Field, where Jackie Robinson and the Brooklyn Dodgers proved that integration wasn't just morally right, but practically beneficial. They showed that when you bring together people from different backgrounds and give them a common purpose, you create something stronger than the sum of its parts. As she spoke, Sarah felt the presence of everyone who had ever called this place home. The baseball fans of the 1950s, the families who had moved into the apartments built on the ballpark site, the immigrants who had found refuge here, the children who had grown up playing in the same courtyard where Major League Baseball had once been played. The developers want to tear down affordable housing to build luxury condos, she continued. They're asking us to repeat the same mistake that was made in 1960 when Ebbets Field was demolished. They're asking us to sacrifice community for profit, to choose exclusion over inclusion, to forget the lessons that this neighborhood has been teaching for generations. The council chamber was unusually quiet, as if everyone present could feel the weight of history in Sarah's words. But we have a choice, Sarah said, her voice rising with conviction. We can choose to honor the legacy of this place by creating development that serves the community rather than displacing it. We can choose to build on the foundation of inclusion and opportunity that Jackie Robinson and his teammates established. We can choose to prove, once again, that diversity and affordability aren't obstacles to overcome, but strengths to celebrate. When Sarah finished speaking, the chamber erupted in applause that seemed to echo far beyond the walls of the building. As she returned to her seat, she felt a hand briefly touch her shoulder, and she knew without looking that Jackie Robinson was acknowledging her contribution to the ongoing struggle for equality and community. The council voted to reject the luxury development proposal, and instead approved Sarah's alternative plan for mixed-income housing that would preserve affordability while improving the neighborhood's infrastructure. It was a victory not just for the current residents, but for the principle that communities should be strengthened rather than displaced by development. Chapter 4: Home Plate Forever. The victory at the city council meeting marked a turning point, not just for the neighborhood, but for Sarah's understanding of her role as a bridge between past and present. As winter settled over Crown Heights, she found that her evening conversations with Hal in the courtyard had evolved into something resembling a planning session for the future, rather than simply a remembrance of the past. "You know what we need to do now?" Sarah said one December evening, as they sat bundled in winter coats, watching their breath form clouds in the cold air. "We need to create something permanent. Something that honors what happened here while serving the community that lives here now." Hal nodded, his hands wrapped around a thermos of hot coffee. At 87, he moved more slowly than he had even a few months ago, but his mind remained sharp and his passion for the neighborhood's history burned as bright as ever. "What did you have in mind?" Sarah had been thinking about this for weeks, inspired by her supernatural encounters and her growing understanding of how places could hold and transmit memory across generations. "A community garden," she said, "right here in the courtyard where Home Plate used to be. a place where people can grow food together, where children can learn about the neighborhood's history, where we can gather for community meetings and celebrations. As if summoned by her words, the familiar warmth of Jackie Robinson's presence filled the air around them. But tonight, Sarah sensed something different in the supernatural atmosphere. Instead of the urgent, almost desperate quality that had characterized the ghostly encounters during the fight against the luxury development, there was now a feeling of satisfaction, of completion, as if a long-held breath was finally being released. "He approves," Hal said quietly, and Sarah knew he was right. Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into the garden project with the same intensity she had brought to opposing the development. She organized planning meetings, applied for grants, coordinated with the city's parks department, and recruited volunteers from throughout the neighborhood. The project became a focal point for community building, bringing together residents who might never have spoken to each other otherwise. Mrs. Rodriguez, the elderly Dominican woman who had seen Jackie Robinson's spirit during the community meeting, became the garden's unofficial coordinator for the Spanish-speaking residents. Mr. Kim, a Korean War veteran who had moved to the neighborhood in the 1970s, volunteered to build raised beds and teach children about composting. The Hassan family, recent immigrants from Somalia, contributed knowledge about growing herbs and vegetables that could thrive in Brooklyn's climate. As spring arrived and the garden began to take shape, Sarah noticed that the supernatural phenomena were changing. Instead of the dramatic appearances of ghostly baseball players, she now experienced subtler signs of spiritual presence. The feeling of being watched with approval as she worked in the soil, the sense that invisible hands were helping when she struggled with heavy tools, the conviction that every plant that took root was somehow connected to the deeper roots of community that had been growing in this place for generations. The garden's official opening ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday in late May, exactly 65 years after Jackie Robinson's final game at Ebbets Field. Sarah had planned a simple celebration with food, music, and speeches from community leaders, but as the day approached, she sensed that something more significant was going to happen. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and warm, with the kind of perfect spring weather that made even long-time New Yorkers stop and appreciate the beauty of their city. As Sarah arrived at the garden early to help with setup, she found Hal already there, sitting on a bench that the teenagers had built and positioned where home plate would have been. "I've been thinking about that little girl," he said, as Sarah joined him on the bench. "The one who gave me the baseball at the last game in 1957. She said she wanted to keep the ballpark alive by remembering it. I think we've done that, Sarah. But more than that, we've kept alive what the ballpark represented." When Sarah stepped forward to address the gathering that had filled the courtyard, she felt as if she were speaking not just to the people physically present, but to everyone who had ever called this place home. "This garden grows in soil that once supported the dreams of millions of baseball fans," she began. "But more importantly, it grows in soil that has always nurtured the dream of community, the belief that people from different backgrounds can come together and create something beautiful and lasting." As she spoke, Sarah noticed that the supernatural presences were beginning to fade, not disappearing, but becoming integrated into the living community around them. The spirits of Ebbets Field were no longer separate from the present moment, but had become part of the ongoing story of the neighborhood. The ceremony concluded with Hal presenting the signed baseball to the community garden, where it would be displayed in a small memorial pavilion that told the story of Ebbets Field and its connection to the neighborhood's ongoing evolution. As he placed the ball in its place of honor, Sarah felt the last of the supernatural presence settle into peace, no longer haunting the site, but blessing it. That evening, as Sarah and Hal sat in the garden watching the sunset paint the sky above Brooklyn, they reflected on their journey from that first ghostly encounter to this moment of community celebration. "Do you think they're really gone?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Hal smiled, his weathered hands resting on the arm of the bench. They're not gone, Sarah. They're home. They're part of this place now. Part of every conversation that happens here, every child who learns to garden here, every neighbor who finds community here. They're part of the story that's still being written. As if to confirm his words, a gentle breeze stirred through the garden, carrying the scent of growing things and the sound of children's laughter from the apartment buildings around them. Sarah felt a deep sense of completion, not because the work was finished, but because she finally understood that it never would be, that each generation would face its own challenges and opportunities to choose community over division, inclusion over exclusion, hope over fear. The Ghosts of Ebbets Field had taught her that the most powerful hauntings weren't about the past refusing to die, but about the past inspiring the living to build something worthy of the dreams that had come before. In this small corner of Brooklyn, where a legendary ballpark had once stood and where a community garden now grew, those dreams were alive and flourishing, rooted in soil that would nourish generations yet to come. Brooklyn, after all, has always been a place where the past and present dance together, where every street corner holds 1,000 memories, and where even the ghosts stick around, not to haunt, but to remind us that some games are too important to ever really end. The work continues, the community grows, and somewhere in the rustle of tomato plants and the laughter of children, the spirit of Ebbets Field lives on, as eternal as the hope that tomorrow's game might be the one that changes everything.